I grew up in a small house on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where every neighbor knew every car, and every car knew every driveway. My mother worked long shifts at a regional hospital as a nurse, and my father, when he was still living with us, worked at a plant an hour away that made parts for tractors. I was the middle child of three, with an older sister who acted like a second mother and a younger brother who acted like a small tornado. From the outside, we looked ordinary in the way that a lot of small-town families look ordinary, which is to say we looked fine as long as no one looked too closely. But even as a very young child, I remember feeling that there was something inside me that did not match the outside of me, and I did not have the words for it, and no one around me had the words for it either, so for a long time I simply thought I was wrong. Not different, not unique, not searching. Wrong. That word sat in my chest for most of my childhood like a small stone I couldn't cough up. The first memory I have of that feeling is not dramatic. I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on the carpet in my sister's room while she got ready for a school photo. She had laid out a soft blue dress on her bed, and she was brushing her hair in front of a little mirror on her dresser, and I remember watching her and feeling something I still don't know how to describe accurately, even now, all these years later. It wasn't envy exactly, and it wasn't admiration exactly, and it certainly wasn't anything sexual, because I was a child and children do not think that way, no matter what cruel adults sometimes pretend. It was more like recognition. Like I was looking at a version of a life that felt, in some quiet inner corner of me, closer to my own than the one I was actually living. I remember reaching out and touching the sleeve of that blue dress, and I remember my sister laughing, not meanly, just a normal sister laugh, and saying something like, "You're funny." And I laughed too because I knew even at that age that I was supposed to laugh. Even at 5 or 6, I already understood that some feelings were meant to be kept small enough to fit inside a joke. For years after that, I performed the version of myself that everyone expected. I played with the toys I was given, wore the clothes I was given, answered to the name I was given, and joined the games the other boys played at recess. I was not bullied for being unusual, because I worked very hard to not be unusual. I studied the other boys the way an anthropologist might study a tribe, memorizing which words were safe, which gestures were safe, which laughter was safe. I was a good student, quiet, well-behaved, the kind of child teachers described as sweet and mature for his age. And on the inside, I was exhausted in a way that a child should never have to be exhausted, because performing yourself into a shape that isn't yours takes an enormous amount of energy, and no one around you can see where the energy is going. The first time I ever put on something that wasn't meant for me, I was 9 years old. My sister had grown out of a soft gray cardigan, and my mother had folded it into a bag destined for donation, and the bag sat in the hallway for 2 days before anyone remembered to take it to the church. On the second night, I could not sleep. I remember standing in the dark hallway in my pajamas, listening to the house breathe around me, and I remember the terrible, thumping feeling of my own heart as I bent down and lifted that cardigan out of the bag. I did not fully understand what I was doing. I only knew that some part of me needed, to feel something soft and unfamiliar against my skin, something that belonged to a version of my life that I wasn't allowed to live during the day. I put it on in the bathroom with the door locked. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. I did not look at myself in the mirror, because I was afraid of what I would feel if I did. Then I took it off, folded it as carefully as I could, put it back in the bag, and went to bed. I lay awake for a long time after, and I remember thinking, very clearly, that was the worst thing I have ever done. Not because I felt something shameful, but because I felt something at all. Feeling anything, in a house that did not have room for my feelings, seemed like the most dangerous thing in the world. I want to pause here for a moment because I know some people listening might be waiting for me to say that what I felt that night was thrilling or exciting in some sensational way, and I want to be very honest with you. It wasn't. That's the part that a lot of stories about people like me get wrong. When you are a child who is quietly, patiently, painfully trying to figure out who you are, the moments of discovery are not fireworks. They're more like the sound of a door somewhere in the house opening very slightly, and you don't know if someone is coming in or going out, and you don't know if the draft you feel is warm or cold. It is confusing, and it is lonely, and above all, it is quiet. If we spent more time listening to the quiet parts of people's lives, I think we would misunderstand each other a lot less. The years between 9 and 13 were a kind of slow, invisible war inside me. On the outside, I grew taller, my voice began to change, my grades stayed good, and I joined the school band because my mother thought it would be nice for me to have a hobby. On the inside, I began to develop what I now understand to be a very thorough and very lonely system of self-management. I made rules for myself. I was not allowed to look too long at the girls section in the department store when my mother took us shopping. I was not allowed to think about certain things before I fell asleep. I was not allowed to let my wrist bend a certain way when I held a pencil because I had noticed that the other boys did not hold their pencils like that, and I had noticed that the ones who did were teased. I was not allowed to cry, ever, no matter what happened, because I had decided that crying was a leak in the wall I was building, and if the wall leaked, everything behind it would come out. I kept those rules very strictly, and I was proud in a small, sad way of how well I kept them. I thought I was being a good person. I did not yet understand that a person who spends every waking hour policing himself is not being good. He is being hidden. My father left when I was 12. That is its own story, and it isn't really the story I'm here to tell, so I will only say that his leaving was slow and quiet, and by the time he was actually gone, most of him had already been gone for a long time. What I remember most about that year is not his absence, but the way my mother changed. She had always been strong, but after he left she became strong in a different way, a way that had edges. She worked more hours, slept less, laughed less, and started keeping the house in a very particular kind of order, as if a tidy kitchen could make up for a broken family. I understood even then that she was doing her best. But her best had less room in it for me than it used to, and I learned to take up less space so that I would not add to her tiredness. I got better at being invisible. I got worse at being real. It was around this time that I began to explore, very cautiously, what I now recognize as questions about my own identity. I want to be careful with the language here because I know that a lot of people listening to this may be at different points in their own understanding, and I don't want to speak as if there is only one way to interpret what I was going through. All I can tell you is what it felt like from inside. It felt like there was a version of me that only came out when I was completely alone, and that version was calmer and more curious and more gentle than the version of me that everyone else got to see. That version liked softer things. That version wanted to be spoken to differently. That version, when I finally let it look in the mirror one night at 13, wearing a hoodie of my sister's that was too big for either of us, did not feel like a stranger. It felt like the person I had been waiting for. I did not have language for any of this. This was before I knew any of the words that people use now, and even if I had known the words, I don't think I would have used them for myself because using a word for yourself is a serious thing, and I was not ready to be serious about who I was. So instead I did what a lot of people do at that age. I hid. I kept the hoodie under my mattress for 3 days and then, in a burst of panic, put it back in my sister's closet because I convinced myself that keeping it was a crime and returning it was a kind of redemption. I told myself I would never do anything like that again. I told myself I would grow out of it. I told myself that if I just tried harder to be the boy everyone thought I was, the other feelings would fade. I made that promise to myself many, many times over the next few years, and I broke it quietly many, many times, and each time I broke it I hated myself a little more, and each time I hated myself a little more, I promised a little harder. That cycle is one of the most important things I want to talk about tonight, because I don't think enough people understand it. When you are a young person who feels different in a way you cannot explain, the hardest part is not the difference itself. The hardest part is the loop of self-punishment that builds up around the difference. You do a small thing that feels honest. You feel shame about the honesty. You promise yourself you will never be honest again. You break the promise because honesty is not something you can actually get rid of, only bury. You feel more shame. You promise harder. And on for years, and the whole time, on the outside, you look completely fine. You get good grades. You do your chores. You smile at church. You go to birthday parties. Nobody can see the loop. And because nobody can see it, you start to believe that nobody would understand it. And once you believe that, you become very, very lonely in a very specific way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not felt it. If you have felt it, I don't need to describe it. If you haven't, please, just trust me that it's real. I was 15 when my mother found out. I want to tell you about that day because it was the day that everything I had built began to come apart, And also, in a way I could not have understood at the time, the day that a slower and more honest kind of building began. It was a Saturday afternoon in late October. My sister was away at a friend's house. My brother was outside on his bike. My mother was supposed to be working a double shift, but her coworker had covered part of it for her, so she came home 3 hours earlier than I had planned for. I was in my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, wearing a skirt of my sister's that I had taken from the laundry pile because I had been trying, in some private and unfinished way, to see what I looked like. I had not locked my door because I had thought I had hours. I heard her car in the driveway. I heard the front door. I heard her footsteps in the hallway. And then I heard the door of my room open, and I looked up, and my mother was standing in the doorway with her keys still in her hand, and neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. I cannot describe her face to you accurately, because I don't fully remember it. Memory does strange things during moments of shock. What I remember instead is the sound of her keys hitting the floor. She did not drop them so much as let them fall, as if her hand had simply forgotten it was holding anything. And then, still without speaking, she closed the door behind her, walked past me, sat down on the edge of my bed next to me, and put her face in her hands. She did not yell. She did not hit me. She did not tell me to change. She sat there, and she breathed, and after a very long time she said, in a voice that was not angry but was very, very tired, "How long?" And I understood exactly what she was asking, and I could not answer, because if I opened my mouth I was going to cry, and I had promised myself, years ago, that I would never cry, and I was not ready to break that promise yet. So I just shook my head, and she nodded, as if that was answer enough, and then she stood up and left the room, and closed the door behind her, and I sat on the edge of my bed in that skirt for I don't know how long, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nothing did. That, in a way, was more frightening than anything else could have been. The title of the story you clicked on tonight has words in it that I want to address directly because I know why they're there, and I want to be honest with you about what actually happened versus what a title has to do to get someone to stop scrolling. My mother never said the phrase that the title uses. She never said anything like it. What my mother actually said 3 days after that Saturday, when she finally sat me down at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea between us, was much simpler and much harder. She said, "I don't understand what you're going through. I don't know if I ever will. But you are my child, and I am not going to lose another person in this house." And then she cried. And because she cried, I cried too, and I broke the promise I had been keeping since I was 9, and I want you to know that the world did not end when I broke it. The world got a little bigger, actually. It got a little more real. And that was the beginning of everything else. I don't want to make my mother sound like a saint because she wasn't one, and pretending she was would be unfair to who she actually was. In the months after that conversation, she said things that hurt me. She asked questions that showed she didn't understand. She sometimes looked at me in a way that made me feel like an unsolved problem she was tired of trying to solve. She went through phases of trying to fix me, then trying to accept me, then trying to fix me again and back to acceptance, in a cycle that took years to settle. She was a woman in her early 40s who had grown up in a place and a time that had not given her any tools for what she was suddenly being asked to hold. She did the best she could with what she had, and sometimes her best was not enough, and sometimes it was more than I had any right to expect, and I think that is true of most parents of most children who turn out to be, in one way or another, unexpected. I want to say that clearly for anyone listening who is a parent right now, sitting in the dark with your own worries about your own child, you will not do this perfectly. Nobody does. What matters is that you do not stop trying, and that when you fail, you say so, and that when your child needs you to simply be there, you are there. The next few years of my life were not a straight line. I want to be very clear about that because a lot of stories about people like me get told as if there is a tidy arc, confusion, then discovery, then acceptance, then happiness, the end. Real life is not like that. Real life is more like weather. You have good days and bad days, and sometimes you have a whole good season, and then a storm comes out of nowhere and knocks over things you thought you had nailed down, and you have to start rebuilding without knowing when the next storm is coming. Between 15 and 20, I went through what I would now call a long, uneven exploration of who I was, and I did not always handle it well, and neither did the people around me. I want to talk honestly about some of the mistakes I made during those years, because I think the most useful thing I can offer anyone listening is not a story where I am the hero, but a story where I am a real person with real failures who eventually learned some things worth passing on. One of the biggest mistakes I made was assuming that because my mother had not rejected me, everyone else in my life would react the same way. So when I was 16, I told my best friend, a boy I had known since second grade, about some of what I was going through. I did not tell him everything, because I did not have language for everything yet, but I told him enough. And he did not know what to do with it. He was 16 too. He had grown up in the same small town I had grown up in. He had the same limited vocabulary for these things that I had. He listened. He said the right words, more or less. And then, over the next few weeks, he slowly stopped calling me back. He stopped saving me a seat at lunch. He stopped inviting me to things. He did not do anything dramatic. He just quietly disappeared from my life, the way people sometimes do when they are given something they do not know how to carry. I was devastated in a way that I did not have permission to talk about, because I could not tell anyone why I had lost my best friend without also telling them everything else. I carried that grief silently for a long time, and it taught me a lesson I want to share with anyone in a similar position. Not everyone you love will be able to meet you where you are, and their inability is not always about hatred. Sometimes it is about fear. Sometimes it is about their own limits. That does not make it hurt less, but it does mean that the story you tell yourself about why they left matters, and if you tell yourself the story that they left because you are unlovable, you will carry a wound that is much bigger than the actual event. Tell yourself, instead, that they left because they were not ready. Then leave the door open, in case they ever become ready. Sometimes years later, they do. Sometimes they don't. Either way, your worth was never the thing on trial. Another mistake I made in those years was trying to speed up my own understanding of myself. I read everything I could find. I stayed up too late on too many nights, trying to figure out which word applied to me, which category I belonged to, which label would finally make the confusion stop. I wanted a diagnosis, in a way, because a diagnosis would have felt like a resting place. But identity does not work that way, at least it did not for me. Every time I thought I had figured out what I was, I would live with that answer for a few weeks or a few months, and then something would shift, and I would have to start again. I got frustrated with myself. I accused myself of being fake, of being confused, of making things up. I now understand that I was not any of those things. I was a young person going through one of the most private and most gradual processes a human being can go through, and I was trying to do it on a schedule, and schedules do not work on souls. If you are listening to this, and you are somewhere in the middle of trying to figure out who you are, I want to gently offer you this. You do not owe anyone a finished answer. You do not owe yourself a finished answer. You are allowed to say, I am still learning about myself, for as long as you need to. That sentence is not a failure. It is one of the most honest things a person can say. I also, and I want to say this plainly because I think it is important, went through a period where I was not kind to my mother. I was 17, and I had spent years feeling like I had to hide, and now that I was slowly allowing myself to not hide, I became, for a while, unfairly angry at everyone who had ever made hiding feel necessary. My mother took most of that anger because she was closest and because she was safe, and because children, even growing children, often unload their hardest feelings onto the parent they trust most, which is a strange and unfair kind of compliment. I said things to her in that year that I still think about when I cannot sleep. I told her she had never really loved me. I told her she had only kept me around out of guilt. I told her once, in a fight that started over something as small as a dinner plate, that she was the reason I had spent my childhood hating myself. None of that was true. Some of it was almost true, in a way that half-truths are the most dangerous of all lies. But most of it was just pain looking for a place to land. She took it. She did not throw it back at me. She would sometimes cry and sometimes leave the room and sometimes just sit there and wait for me to run out of words. And then later, when I had calmed down, she would come back and say something like, I know you're hurting. I am too. Let's try again tomorrow. I did not appreciate that at the time. I appreciate it now more than I can say. If your parent is trying, even imperfectly, please try to notice. The apology you give them later will be easier if you don't have too much to apologize for. By the time I was 18, I had begun, slowly and quietly, to make peace with some of who I was. I had stopped punishing myself every time I explored the parts of me that did not fit the shape I had been assigned. I had started, in careful, private ways, to allow myself to look in the mirror and not flinch. I had also started to understand that whatever I was, whatever word eventually fit or did not fit, was not the whole of me. I was also a student and a son and a brother and a friend and a person who liked bad science fiction novels and long walks in cold weather and the smell of my grandmother's kitchen. Identity is not a single note. It is a chord. And for a long time I had been trying to hear only one string of that chord and hating myself for the sound of it, when in fact the whole chord, all of it together, was what made me a person. Learning to hear the whole chord was, I think, the most important thing that happened to me in my late teenage years, more important than any single decision about how I dressed or what I called myself. Once I could hear the whole chord, the individual notes stopped scaring me. I left home at 19 to go to a state university about 4 hours from where I grew up. I want to talk a little about that time, not because it was the most dramatic period of my life, but because I think it is the period that a lot of people misunderstand when they think about people like me. There is a popular narrative that says, young person leaves small town, arrives at big city or big campus, immediately transforms into a completely different person, and lives happily ever after. That was not my experience. My experience was much slower, much more ordinary, and in the long run, much more real. I did not arrive on campus and immediately become someone new. I arrived on campus and became, for the first time, someone with the freedom to be gradual. That is a different thing, and it is, I think, an underrated gift. I took classes. I made friends slowly. I joined one club, then another, then quit them both. I called my mother every Sunday. I did not, in that first year, tell anyone at school anything about the parts of myself that I had spent so much of my life hiding. I just lived. And in the living, without the constant surveillance of a small town, I discovered how much of my exhaustion had been coming not from who I was, but from the effort of pretending not to be. By my second year of college, I had begun in small ways to let myself be more visible. I started with things that felt safe. A ring I liked. A sweater that did not belong to any particular gender dial. A way of speaking that felt more like my own voice and less like the voice I had trained myself to use. Nobody around me said anything. That was, in itself, a revelation. I had grown up believing that any deviation from expected behavior would be immediately noticed and immediately punished. In reality, most people, most of the time, are far too busy with their own lives to keep detailed track of yours. That knowledge was liberating, and it was also, in a quieter way, humbling. Because if most people were not paying that much attention to me, then most of the shame I had built up over the years had been a private construction. I had been my own warden for so long that I had forgotten I was also the prisoner. Realizing that I held both keys was one of the most important shifts of my adult life. I want to talk now about something that took me a long time to learn, and that I think is one of the most important things I can share with anyone listening, whether or not any of the specifics of my story apply to yours. It is this: self-acceptance is not the same thing as self-indulgence, and self-exploration is not the same thing as escape from responsibility. In the years when I was first allowing myself to be more visibly who I was, I had to learn, sometimes the hard way, that discovering who you are does not exempt you from being a decent person. It does not give you permission to be cruel to people who are struggling to understand you. It does not give you permission to abandon obligations you have made. It does not give you permission to treat your own becoming as an emergency that everyone else in your life must drop everything to accommodate. I met people during those years who had confused liberation with license and who used their own long-suppressed pain as a justification for causing new pain to others. I understood the impulse. I had felt it myself. But I watched what it did to their relationships and to their sense of themselves, and I made a decision that I want to pass on to anyone listening. Whoever you are becoming, become someone kind. Nothing about self-discovery requires you to become harsh. In fact, in my experience, the more honestly you understand yourself, the more patient you can afford to be with everyone else, because you no longer need them to reflect you back to yourself. You already know who you are. That knowledge is what makes gentleness possible. I also had to learn in those years that the people who had known me before I had begun to change were going to need time to catch up, and that giving them that time was not a betrayal of myself, but a kindness, both to them and to me. When I went home from college for holidays, my mother sometimes still used the wrong words for me, out of habit, out of confusion, out of the sheer weight of 19 years of speaking one way. I had a choice in those moments, and I did not always make it well. Sometimes I was patient. Sometimes I was sharp. Sometimes I would leave the room and cry in the bathroom and then come back and pretend nothing had happened. Over time, I learned that patience with the people who love you is not the same as accepting mistreatment. There is a difference between someone who is trying and slipping and someone who is refusing to try. My mother was trying. My sister was trying. My brother, in his own quieter way, was trying. They earned my patience by their effort, not by their perfection. And I earned their patience by mine. I want to say something now about mental health, because I would not be telling you an honest story if I skipped over this part. There were long stretches in my late teens and early 20s when I was not well. I do not want to describe the details in a way that could be harmful to anyone listening who might be in a difficult place themselves, so I am going to keep this section careful. But I will say that there were nights when I did not know how I was going to make it to the morning, and there were mornings when I did not know how I was going to make it to the night. The weight of years of hiding, the grief of friendships lost, the fear of an uncertain future, the ordinary heartbreaks that everyone has in their 20s, and the specific loneliness of feeling like nobody around me had lived what I was living. All of it added up, sometimes, to more than I could hold. What saved me, in those years, was not any single dramatic intervention. It was small and unglamorous things. It was a counselor at the University Health Center who was not perfect but who listened and who kept scheduling me for the next week and the next week and the next week. It was my mother's Sunday phone calls, which she never missed, even when I was too tired to say much. It was one friend, a young woman named Margaret, who did not fully understand what I was going through but who understood that showing up was the point, and who kept showing up. It was walks. It was writing things down in a notebook that no one else would ever read. It was, more than anything, the slow, boring, essential work of learning to be a friend to myself. If you are listening to this and you are struggling, I want to say two things directly to you, and then I will return to the story. The first is that you do not have to figure everything out in order to deserve help. You are allowed to reach out for support before you have all the answers about who you are. In fact, reaching out is often part of how the answers begin to arrive. The second is that the people who love you would rather have you confused and alive than certain and gone. I know that in the middle of a bad night, that sentence can be hard to believe. Please believe it anyway. If you cannot believe it for yourself yet, borrow my belief until yours comes back. It does come back. It came back for me, and I was not, at the time, a person who thought it would. By my mid-20s, I had settled into a version of my life that felt, for the first time, genuinely mine. I want to be careful, again, not to make this sound like a fairy tale, because it wasn't. I still had bad days. I still had moments when I looked in the mirror and did not fully recognize the reflection, and moments when I looked in the mirror and recognized it so completely that I cried. I had a small circle of friends who knew me well and loved me anyway, which is really the only kind of love worth having. I had a job that was not glamorous but was honest, working at a nonprofit that helped young people access educational resources. I had a small apartment with too many books and one very opinionated cat. I had a relationship, my first serious one, with a person who had done their own long work of self-understanding and who therefore had the patience to walk alongside mine. That relationship did not last forever, and its ending taught me things I did not want to learn, but am glad I did. But while it lasted, it gave me a glimpse of something I had not known was possible when I was 15 years old, sitting on the edge of my bed with my mother in the doorway. The possibility of being fully seen by another person and being loved not in spite of what they saw, but because of it. I also, in those years, began to rebuild some of the relationships that had been damaged during my more turbulent stretches. I want to talk about one of them in particular because I think it might be useful to anyone listening who is in a similar place. My father, who had left when I was 12, had been mostly absent from my life for a long time. We spoke on birthdays. We saw each other, awkwardly, at my sister's high school graduation. He had never known any of the parts of me that I've been talking about tonight, because I had never trusted him enough to tell him, and because he had never made himself close enough to me to be told. When I was 26, my mother called me to say that he had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and that he did not have as much time as any of us had assumed. I sat with that news for a week before I did anything with it. Then I drove 5 hours to the small apartment where he was living, and I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he looked at me for a long time, and then he stepped aside and let me in. I want to tell you what happened during that visit, but I don't want to romanticize it, because it was not a movie. He did not immediately understand who I had become. He did not immediately apologize for all the years he had been gone. We sat at his small kitchen table for a long time, and we drank bad instant coffee, and we talked about nothing for a while, and then we talked about something. I told him, in as few words as I could manage, some of what my life had been. He listened. He did not say much. When I was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I don't know what to say to you. I've missed a lot. I don't have time to catch up on all of it, but I want to try." And I said, "That's enough for now." And it was. We saw each other several more times before he died the following spring. We did not become close in the way that some fathers and children are close. But we became something, and that something was better than the nothing we had been. When he died, I grieved a father I had never really had, and also a father I had only just begun to have, and those two griefs did not cancel each other out. They sat side by side, the way most real emotions do. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that a life like mine or a life like anyone's is not made up of one big story. It is made up of a lot of small stories, some of which are about identity, and some of which are about family, and some of which are about grief, and some of which are about the ordinary business of being a human being who has to buy groceries and go to work and remember to call people back. The parts of my life that had to do with figuring out who I was were important, but they were not the whole of me, and I did not become fully myself the day I first understood something about my own identity. I became fully myself, or more fully myself, over many years, through many small acts of honesty and many small acts of forgiveness and many small acts of showing up, both for myself and for the people around me. That is what becoming a person actually looks like in my experience. It is not a single revelation. It is a long, patient practice. Now, in my 30s, I sometimes get asked by younger people who are where I was at 15 or 17 or 20, what advice I would give them. I am always cautious about giving advice, because every life is different, and what worked for me may not work for anyone else. But there are a few things I have come to believe, and I will share them with you now, in case any of them are useful. If none of them are useful to you personally, perhaps you can pass them on to someone else. The first is that you do not have to have everything figured out to be worthy of love, respect, or a place in the world. If you are still asking questions about who you are not broken. You are alive. The people who seem to have it all figured out are almost always either lying or are about to be surprised by their own next chapter. Give yourself permission to be a work in progress. That is the only kind of person there is. The second is that self-honesty is a practice, not an event. You do not tell the truth about yourself once, and then never have to tell it again. You tell it every day, in small ways, to yourself first, and then, when you are ready, to others. Some days you will tell it well, and some days you will lie a little to get through the afternoon, and that is all right, as long as you come back the next day and tell the truth again. Honesty is not a destination. It is a direction you keep walking in. The third is that the people who love you are almost always capable of more than you expect, and also less than you hope. Do not underestimate them, and do not over-rely on them. Give them the chance to surprise you, but do not build your whole life on the assumption that they will. If they come through for you, be grateful. If they don't, be sad, and then be resourceful. There is more than one kind of family. Some of the most important people in your life will be people you have not met yet. The fourth is that being different, in whatever way you are different, is not a license to be unkind. In fact, I would go further. The people who have suffered most from being misunderstood have a particular responsibility not to misunderstand others. If you have known what it is like to be looked at without being seen, please do not do that to anyone else. Your pain is not a currency you can spend on cruelty. Use it instead as a form of vision. The world has enough people who are already good at not looking. It needs more people who have learned, through their own long practice, how to look carefully. The fifth is that responsibility and freedom are not opposites. Some of the freest people I know are also the most responsible because they have learned that keeping their word, showing up for the people they love, and doing the unglamorous work of building a life are what make freedom possible in the first place. If you are young and you have just begun to discover parts of yourself that feel new and important, please do not let anyone tell you that in order to honor those parts, you have to become someone who cannot be counted on. You can be honest about who you are and still be someone who returns phone calls, who pays their bills, who apologizes when they are wrong. In fact, being those things is part of how your honesty about yourself becomes safe for the people around you. Trust is what turns a private truth into a shared life. The sixth thing I want to say is about hope, and I want to say it carefully because I am aware that hope, when it is offered too cheaply, can feel like an insult to people who are in real pain. I am not going to tell you that everything will be fine because I do not know that, and neither do you, and neither does anyone. What I will tell you is that many things that seem impossible at 15 become bearable at 20, and many things that seem unbearable at 20 become ordinary at 30, and many things that seem ordinary at 30 become, in retrospect, some of the most important experiences of your life. Time is not a cure, but it is a kind of ally if you can stay in relationship with it. The version of you that will exist in 10 years is a real person, waiting for you to reach them. You do not have to know exactly who they are. You only have to keep them company one day at a time until you both arrive. I want to circle back before I close to my mother because so much of this story has been about her, in one way or another. She is in her 60s now. She still lives in the same small house on the edge of the same small town. She still keeps the kitchen tidy in that particular way. She still works too many hours, although she has finally begun to talk about retirement. When I visit her now, which I do as often as I can, we sit at the same kitchen table where we sat when I was 15, and we drink tea out of the same mugs, and we talk about ordinary things. The neighbors, the garden, the price of eggs, my brother's kids. Sometimes, when the conversation gets quiet, she will look at me across the table with a kind of soft attention, and I know what she is thinking about without her having to say it. She is thinking about the long road that brought us both to this quiet afternoon. She is thinking about the mistakes she made, and the mistakes I made, and the way we somehow managed, together, to keep loving each other through all of them. A few years ago, on one of those quiet afternoons, she said something to me that I want to share with you, because it has stayed with me ever since. She said, "I used to think being a good mother meant knowing exactly what your child needed. Now I think being a good mother means being willing to keep learning what your child needs, for as long as they're your child, which is forever." Then she took a sip of her tea, and she smiled a small tired smile, and we went back to talking about the garden. I don't think she knew, in that moment, that she had said something important. That is often how the most important things get said. Not in speeches. In kitchens. Over tea. If there is one thing I hope you take away from tonight, it is this. Whoever you are and whoever the people around you are all still becoming. Nobody in your life is a finished person. Not your parents. Not your children. Not your friends. Not you. That can be a frightening thought if you are hoping for stability. It can also be a hopeful thought if you are hoping for change. Most of the time in a real life, it is both. The trick, I think, is to stop waiting for everyone to arrive at their final shape and to start loving the people around you and yourself in whatever shape you are all in today. Tomorrow, you will all be a slightly different shape. Love that one too. Keep going. I have talked for a long time tonight, and I want to respect your time by beginning to bring this to a close. I want to say one more time that this has been my story and not a template. If parts of it resonated with you, I am glad, but please do not try to map my life onto yours. Your life is going to look different from mine, and it is going to have its own particular shape, and its own particular griefs, and its own particular joys, and its own particular people who will love you imperfectly, and whom you will love imperfectly back. That is not a failure of the story. That is the story. The details are where the meaning lives. If you are a young person listening to this, and you are somewhere in the confusion I was in at 9 or 13 or 15, I want you to know that the confusion is not the whole of your life. It feels like it right now because right now is the only time you have ever been alive. But there are many other times waiting for you, and in some of them, You will look back at this version of yourself with a great deal of tenderness. Try, if you can, to be tender with that version now, even while you are still inside it. You are doing something very hard, and no one around you can fully see it, and you deserve, at the very least, your own gentle attention. If you are a parent listening to this, and you are worried about a child who is quiet in ways you do not understand, or who has said something to you that you did not know how to answer, or who seems to be building a wall between you that you cannot climb, I want to say to you what my mother eventually learned to say to me. You do not have to understand everything. You do not have to have the right words. You only have to stay. Stay in the room. Stay at the table. Stay on the phone. Stay in the life of your child. Even when you are frightened, even when you are tired, even when you are angry, even when they push you away. Staying is not the same as agreeing. Staying is not the same as approving. Staying is its own act. In my experience, it is the most important one a parent can perform. If you are a sibling or a friend or a coworker or a neighbor or anyone in the wider circle of a person who is going through something like what I went through, I want to say to you, you do not have to be an expert to be helpful. You do not have to know the right words or the right terminology or the right politics. You only have to be someone who treats the person in front of you as a person. That is a much lower bar than most of us think it is, and yet it is a bar that a great many people fail to clear, not out of malice, but out of forgetfulness. Remember, that is the whole practice. Remember that the person in front of you is a person. If you can do that, most of the rest will follow. And if you are none of these people, if you have just clicked on this story out of curiosity, and none of it maps onto your life in any obvious way, I still hope you have found something useful here. Every life, no matter how different from your own, contains something that touches yours. That is the strange gift of listening to stories that are not ours. We come away not less ourselves, but more, because we have been reminded of how many ways there are to be a person, and how much there is to learn from every one of them. I do not know exactly where my own story goes from here. I am, as I said, still becoming. I have plans, and I have fears, and I have days when I feel like I have finally figured something out, and days when I feel like I am starting over again. I suspect that will be true for the rest of my life. I have made a kind of peace with it. What I have learned is that the goal is not to stop becoming. The goal is to become in a direction that you can live with, and to bring, as gently as you can, the people you love along with you, and to allow yourself to be brought along by them in return. That is not a destination. That is a way of walking. I intend to keep walking for as long as I am given, and I hope that whoever you are, wherever you are listening from tonight, you keep walking too. There is more waiting for you. I promise. Even on the nights when it doesn't feel like there could be. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.